Well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Collision Live. Daniel here, and joined at the desk by the soggy French fries to my McDonald's Happy Meal, Mr. Samuel David Kemp. What is up?
Well, I don't like soggy French fries, that's for sure. But otherwise, it's been a good week. Spring is just around the corner, so we've been planting seeds.
Bring on allergies. Best part of spring for someone like me.
I'm not crying. It's just the pollen.
I'm legit just allergic to the outdoors. Just grass. Just being outside makes me kind of get all swelt.
That's true.
So it's hey, you guys enjoy it as you do, and I will be hiding away in my house trying not to get
hermetically
sick.
sealed bunker.
But there's a reason for that. And hey, as an introvert, there's worse things that could happen. But
that's true.
Anything else kind of going on this week?
Other than that, no, I don't think so.
Other than some crazy fun, this kind of interesting topics to get into here for pop culture. I want to thank you guys for joining us. If you're watching us live in our live stream, or if you're listening to us on our audio-only podcast version that we launched a couple weeks ago. However, you're joining us. If you're doing the audio-only, just know that both of us are kind of well-built, ruggedly handsome.
Yeah.
Got fantastic mustaches. But we're excited to kind of dig into it. If you've never joined us before for the Collision Live, it's really just our weekly show where we take kind of a biblical Christian worldview perspective and kind of look at everything that's going on today in our culture, whether that's pop culture or just trends or just sort of questions that people are asking. And this is an interesting one because I think there's a couple kind of bigger topics, things that maybe aren't as easy to dig into, maybe a little more nuanced and just a little more heated, kind of important topics. So we'll be getting into that this week. And again, if you guys are watching us live, I encourage you guys, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to have a conversation with you about this. If you have opinions on this, if you want to correct Sam's viewpoint on why it's wrong, all those things, we welcome those comments and just want to have a kind of a conversation about these cultural issues. But to kick things off, like we always do here at the Collision Live, we got pop culture news. So a couple stories that kind of jumped out to me in this last week as far as pop culture things that are happening. A sequel to the Godzilla vs. Kong movie just kind of started production. I guess they're going to have another face-off. One time was not enough. Kind of like Rocky and Apollo Creed. They got to kind of decide once and for all who's the best. The first movie was kind of dumb, but hey, obviously enough people liked it. So that's coming out. Speaking of another kind of fighting creature animal, Kung Fu Panda, the Dragon Knight. A new show was just announced, and this is featuring Jack Black as the voice of Po, the panda. I'll admit, I love these movies. I think the Kung Fu Panda movies are some of the best animated kids movies that are out there. So I'm excited for this. I'm sure I'll end up seeing some of these episodes with my kids. Speaking of things that are shown to kids and maybe shouldn't be shown to kids, and there's going to be conversations on, which we'll get into later in this show in more detail, but this just reported, I think Variety magazine was the one that kind of announced this, that the upcoming Lightyear movie is kind of based on like Toy Story, but it's like the real character, not the toy. I don't really get it, but it's coming out in a couple months, that there was a same-sex kiss that was supposed to be in this movie that was taken out through the editing process with all the political controversies and outrage and walkouts and stuff that have happened that we'll get into in just a few moments. Apparently that kiss has been restored to the finished film. Obviously it's not out yet. Don't know what all that means. But that's just definitely something that people need to be aware of with that movie coming out. And I think in 2 months that comes out. Something else that's coming up sooner than that, this Sunday, the Oscars. For those of you who still celebrate and still care about the Oscars, this Sunday, all the conversations and think pieces about what was snubbed, what deserved to win. I know that I don't mean to totally belittle the Oscars. I know a lot of people care about this, even if it's become somewhat maybe the butt of some jokes in recent years. But so the Oscars, that'll be this Sunday. We'll probably have at least mention it next week with kind of what happened from it. And the last story that probably affects a lot of us that are into pop culture and where you can watch different shows and what you can watch. Amazon continues to buy the world, and included in that is MGM Studios, one of the kind of the old original kind of OG movie studios back in the day. They have bought that. MGM isn't a major player like they used to be, but they still got like James Bond and Rocky and Creed. They got different properties, so I don't know if that means there's going to be like spin-off shows or what's going to happen, but just another example of these streaming services sort of replacing the old school model of studios. So lots of going on, but that's all we have this week in pop culture news. So what are those? Any of those things kind of stand out to you as
I think
interesting?
the most interesting one is the Kung Fu Panda. I'm a huge fan of those. How many have there been? Is it
I think there might be 3.
has it been 3?
I think at least 3.
Okay, maybe I'm not as big of. I haven't been keeping tally,
Yeah.
but I just remember
True fans know that there's been at least 3.
Oh, I know.
You call yourself a Kung Fu Panda fan?
I knew it wasn't a polar bear. Okay. But yeah, those are just super fun movies, and Jack Black, just like, he's a legend, and I think he's just the perfect like voice for the Kung Fu Panda. So I'm excited about that. My inner child rejoices.
That's probably the one that I'm the most excited about. Godzilla vs. Kong. Again, I'm a monster movie person, but I'm not a monster on monster movie kind of person. Like,
yeah, you had a whole. I think you had a soapbox about this.
I have maybe a host corner coming up.
You can maybe go watch his review of the last Kong versus Godzilla and get a sense of what to expect.
Yeah, I don't remember what I said in that movie, but I'm sure the past version of me just hated that movie, so I need to go refresh myself.
Yeah, I mean, other than the Kung Fu Panda, there's just not a whole lot to get excited about.
Yeah, something that maybe
at least in this.
Yeah, not to get excited about, something that is maybe a notable thing, especially as a Christian and just as a parent that goes to a lot of Pixar and kids and Disney movies, is the kind of the Lightyear and kind of the same sex, and how that sort of hit that movie is getting kind of dragged into this kind of cultural war stuff that we have going on, which kind of leads us to the first topic that I wanted us to get into, because there's been a lot of stuff this kind of specifically this week that all relates in some way, kind of shape or form, to kind of this whole idea of like kind of sexuality and what role does that play in kind of these Disney kind of kids movies. Does it play too much of a role? According to some, it should play a bigger role. How do we kind of navigate that? And so some of this came out in the Turning Red, the latest Pixar, and kind of the way it dealt with like puberty and stuff. And is it introducing concepts too soon? And then you have the same sex kiss that was announced, and just some of the kind of the conversations about I think a lot of, at least that we've seen here at the Collision, a lot of Christians, a lot of especially parents, I think, just kind of outraged at kind of Disney, kind of this, whatever this entity is of Disney, and kind of how it has this big agenda and how it's pushing kind of sexuality and this sort of the way that it's being talked about, which is kind of interesting because there's that, and we'll kind of return to that in just a second. But kind of as that's going on, and some of the comments and stuff in our review, and kind of there's a lot of blaming these sicko perverts at Disney and how they're pushing sexuality to kids. The kind of while that's going on, there's sort of been like a second side of this story where Disney is getting blamed by Disney for not pushing it hard enough. Today, actually, is what they call the Disney Do Better walkout. So as we're doing this live stream, a bunch of employees and people at Disney, either the parks or the studio or kind of any of the properties, are walking out and protest for the fact that they don't think that the Disney CEO has taken a firm enough stance against some of the bills being passed in Florida and some of the sexual issues. And there's an interesting letter. I'll read it. It's a segment of it. I encourage you. It is worth checking out, reading the whole thing, because I think it touches on so many areas that are relevant to these conversations. But this is kind of an open letter by Pixar that they wrote to Disney. And I'll just read kind of near the end of this. They kind of air out some complaints about Disney. But this is what they kind of say near the end. It says, finally, we come to the push for content as the answer. We at Pixar have personally witnessed beautiful stories full of diverse characters come back from Disney corporate reviews shaved down to crumbs of what they once were. Nearly every moment of overtly gay affection is cut at Disney's behest, regardless of when there is a protest from both the creative teams and the executive leadership at Pixar. Even if creating an LGBTQIA+ content was the answer to fixing the discriminatory legislation in the world, we are being barred from creating it. Beyond the inspiring content that we aren't even allowed to create, we require action. So this is sort of an interesting, again, I encourage you to check out the whole letter. We can't get into all of it, but you sort of have this juxtaposition of you kind of have a lot of Christians and parents and stuff is mad at Disney and how this sort of this unified, almost like a sensationalist, pushing this sexual agenda. And then you kind of have kind of the dirty laundry being aired out by Disney, that things are maybe a bit more complicated than just sort of Disney, has this unified agenda. So you hear all this. I think you read this letter to Sam. What do you take from this? What's going on with this? How does maybe some of this kind of behind the curtains look? Does that change the discussion at all? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think as with many important topics of our day, there is uh, complexity and nuance, and there,
What?
I know it's shocking, but broad brushes and generalizations don't really help in these instances. They may help sort of fan the flames of whatever agenda you're pushing by sort of overgeneralizing things, but yeah, I think this sort of reveals um, perhaps, and I've seen some headlines to this effect that sort of, maybe this is the end of Disney trying to have it both ways and sort of like, appease sort of the LGBTQ community, but also like keep their core, which is like families and, people like that. And sort of like, well, maybe there's just sort of in the background, you see two boys holding hands, but they're not like on the foreground. And so it's like, oh, look, see, we're inclusive, but as this letter from Pixar sort of pointed out, that it's like, well, you're sort of only in token inclusive, and they're pushing for more. And meanwhile, you have like parents who are saying like, whoa, this is way too much already. So I think it just shows that there isn't a unified Disney that's sort of like coming for your kids, as I think maybe many Christian parents sort of want to believe, that it's like this evil, like perverted Disney that's just trying to corrupt your children.
Yeah, because I even I tweeted this out the other day. I genuinely think that a lot of kind of the way Christians talk about like Disney and stuff is that there is this like image of like these three like shady people in this like dimly lit like smoky room. And they're like smoking cigars and like playing cards and like, how should we turn these kids into perverts? And like there's that it's just sort of like Disney is this like thing where obviously it's not. Like obviously that's not to say that like there isn't a sexual agenda that is getting kind of reflecting out of or like shining out of Disney films. Like that is definitely an issue. But just sort of how we talk about that in a very like, well, I guess we know what Disney's doing. It's like, well, like, like even like I was trying to look up some numbers, like the average like Pixar film, this is like Pixar talking about, the sexuality stuff in Pixar, like I think over 600 people are involved. Obviously not all of those are like at a decision-making level.
Sure.
There are like the top people that call the shots and stuff, but like multiple writers, like different like directors, assistant directors,
and usually a handful of producers that
and even like different CEO, like Pixar CEO, and then you have the Disney CEO, and Disney owns Pixar, and like so it's definitely not. I don't think it helps to overly simplify like the sense that like almost like in a conspiracy that like this sort of, this like satanic all these bunch of sickos at Disney, and like they just like get together every week and try and like brainstorm like how
can we like subliminally input all these like witchcraft signals throughout
like
all of our films.
It's just like, but I think that said, like there is nuance to it. I think there are a lot of storytellers that have an agenda and that are
for sure
sort of the whole, and that's not just Hollywood. That's not this whole sexual kind of just pushing like sex as the be all and end all of identity and meaning and any of that kind of stuff. Like those stories are still coming from somewhere, like through some of these Disney movies, and obviously even like some of these employees, like they're making a push to do more of that.
Yeah.
And even in their letter, it's not even just like it's telling, because it's not even just like, hey, we just want to share our experiences. Like it's also like, hey, this is to make a change and like political and like we need to it's motivated. It is an actual agenda,
right,
rather than just hey, I'm as a gay person, a storyteller, I want to tell a story that kind of reflects my experiences. Like so there is kind of both. Like it's more complicated, but like obviously as parents, like we both know, like there is a sexual agenda that comes out in some of this stuff.
Yeah, well, and I think it's interesting to sort of kind of maybe go back to where maybe a lot of this sort of was kicked off. It was with the legislation that was passed in Florida, which was essentially banning, basically banning any sort of transgender or gay or queer sort of sexual orientation material from being taught from like kindergarten to third grade. And so, and like, I think that was the catalyst that was like, Disney CEO didn't support this or didn't push back against this hard enough. Like, it seems like the LGBTQ community wanted to be able to like teach kids about like queer identities. And these are like kids who don't have sexuality. And I think that's the sort of the thing to at least kind of jumps out to me about this whole sort of hubbub is it's like, wait a second, like let's take a step back and think like this is about like introducing sexuality to children, which I don't care what direction the sexuality goes. Like that's the issue is teaching sexuality to children, like third graders, kindergarten. Like that's where we're wanting to like, that's what the struggle is over is like, well, they're just not being taught, queer identities in kindergarten like they used to. It's like, well, I don't want them being taught any sort of sexual identities like at that age. It's like they're kids. Like that's the problem, at least to me.
Yeah, because that was even like when I did the Turning Red review, which has turned out to be a very controversial review, a very controversial movie. But some of my like I guess uneasiness, I think I enjoyed it more than a lot of Christians seem to have enjoyed it. But some of my like, uneasiness about it was that it's dealing with like puberty and it's dealing with kind of with like sexuality and like the feelings that come along with puberty and like I think those are real life issues that I don't think we should pretend like that doesn't happen or like that it's not appropriate to talk about, but like it's in like the framework of a kids movie,
right?
And I know this as a parent, it's like, well, like do I want any kind of movie with my like I have 7-year-old kids like talking about like they're not at a place where they're trying to understand sexuality or like they don't see like females in a sexual way, like nor should they. And there's an interesting, I guess if you're listening just to the audio only version, you can't see the picture, but there's an interesting book I read that I could recommend for people that I read I think maybe 2 years ago. Neil Postman, who's most famous for the book Amusing Ourselves to Death, sort of like a classic one where he wrote back in like the 40s and looking at like TV and stuff and how that was going to change culture. And he wrote this one called The Disappearance of Childhood. And kind of his whole premise was like as TV kind of was created, that like that was sort of the catalyst for like this like losing of the innocence of childhood, where like back in the day like kind of sexual knowledge and like sexuality and those conversations like was kind of what separated children from adult. Like children couldn't read really yet and couldn't understand these conversations that like becoming an adult is largely based on like having puberty and having these feelings and kind of understanding sexuality. And his whole premise was that because of TV that you kind of lose that distinction, where now like TV can have that knowledge kind of spread wide to kids. And it's interesting because he wrote that book like in the 40s before TV was really taking off. And it's like, that's so happening. Relevant. It's so relevant now that, you have kids that even like my kids at school, where they're talking and their friends about, this girl likes you. And I'm like, you guys are in like first grade. Like no one has like romantic feelings for each other. Yeah. Like, you still have cooties or something like. But it's, I think a lot.
And they're just kids too, and I think that's the thing. It's like, and I think that we saw this even when we talked about one of the latest Pixar movies, Luca, or I don't know, it's not the latest, but maybe a year ago. It's just sort of this great story about these two friends, and like everybody was wanting to read some sort of like
make it sexual.
Yeah, make it sort of a homosexual film about these two closeted boys. It's like since when could like kids not have like a best friend or have friends of the opposite sex that had nothing to do with sex because they're kids. And I think that's really sort of, I feel like at the crux of this, it's not so much about sexuality and orientation and all that sort of stuff. It's really about sexualizing children and wanting to put these sort of conversations in movies that is marketed to kids. And it's like, I don't really care, what orientation it is. Like, I just don't think that has a place, especially in children's movies. And I just like, that seems kind of like a weird thing to be fighting for.
Yeah. That's kind of where I land. And then we can move on to the next segment of our live stream, but that's kind of where I land with it is like, I don't think we're not doing anyone, there's no value in like the real sensational, like conspiratorial, like Disney is this like kind of, black silhouetted person that, is just like this unified entity. And like, they're trying to convert our kids into being these sexual predators or whatever you want to do with it. Like, I don't know if that is necessarily helpful. I don't think that it's way more nuanced than that. But I do think like the more nuanced discussion needs to happen with Christians as far as like, even beyond like the LGBTQ stuff, like just sexuality at all, and the way that it's kind of being introduced to children way too young and kind of losing some of that is something that I think Christians need to be wary of and like think through as far as like, when is it appropriate? Like how much of that is appropriate for like movies and entertainment as opposed to like in the home and parents walking through that. Because I do think like a movie like Turning Red can be valuable for the right age. I think for my issue is just like, what is that age, and is it too early for the packaging? So let us know. Obviously a controversial topic. Speaking of things controversial, me saying things that are wrong, Monty says Amusing Ourselves to Death is from 1985. So I think it is maybe more recent. I do think that...
How can we ever trust you again?
In my defense, I do think this book came out first, and Amusing Ourselves to Death was like the extension of that, as people kind of realized that, and he kind of took that to the next level with media and stuff. But what do I know? But whenever it was written, it was very prophetic. So thanks, Monty, for making me look bad with that.
Honest here, Monty.
But
Appreciate it.
if anyone else wants to share any comments that aren't just correcting me on that topic, because it is a conversation I do think Christians should be having, parents, and I think having thoughtful, critical conversations, and not just Disney's the worst, because I think there is stuff to talk about. But speaking of stuff to talk about, things that are important, sometimes can even be controversial. We have our next segment of our show, which is Host Corner. So this is my chance to kind of take a minute, share something that I thought was interesting that I found. And this thing I found fascinating. This is an article that I just stumbled across the other day called "What AI Thinks an Emily Dickinson's Poem Looks Like." And basically, this is a guy that took Emily Dickinson, the great poet, and took one of her poems, which her poems are weird. Her poems get into some weird stuff. She's a strange poet, but they fed this poem into this like generative AI thing to come up with like illustrations of what kind of AI thinks of her poem. And the stuff that came out of this is like, they're fascinating. They're interesting. You can see some of them on the screen. This is like weird. And like to do, I think the program, you had to kind of pick like genres. So it's like, kind of this like cyberpunk thing and like fantasy or whatever you kind of picked. And then it kind of took those lines and I showed a couple of them, but he did this for every like stanza that came out of this. And I encourage you to Google the article, because it is interesting. Like it's a look at kind of, I guess, stretching the boundaries of like, what is art? Here's like an AI making art, but also just the shortcomings of it and like the inability of like AI to pick up on like some of the subtlety and plays on words and some of that stuff that remains like very distinctively human. So I'm an English nerd. I love art. I think this is cool. But definitely check it out. What AI Thinks an Emily Dickinson's Poem Looks Like. I think there's definitely a lot of cool implications from it. But have you seen this before?
No, I haven't. This is new to me, and I was wondering, is it using something like GPT-3? No, not G. I'm just looking up the article now, but there have been a lot of like things like this, sort of like. You can go to one of my favorite YouTube channels is I think it's a Metal AI, and it's a constant live stream of heavy metal that is being generated by AI, and it's unlistenable. But
as is a lot of metal.
But it is interesting. And then like I think GPT-3 is another sort of AI system that sort of can take text and sort of make stories out of, like, you can just, I think, give it some prompts and then it'll sort of like make up these stories, which often sort of,
because AI wrote like the 8th Harry Potter book. Like they did this. I don't know if you ever saw that.
No,
like,
I didn't see that.
And it's just this like bizarre, like, surrealist kind of story that came up with weird stuff.
So I think it's interesting. And again, I think this sort of comes back to the question of what is art. And so, like, would you say that AI generated interpretation of Emily Dickinson poem, is that art?
Yeah, it's maybe in a future episode we can get deeper into that, but it is like one of those, like, is AI going to replace humans? Like the AI machine, like the algorithm is like plugged in by humans, all the data. Like it wasn't doing this spontaneously. Like all the parameters of it and like what it's taking as like the reference points are all based on like humans. So in some ways, almost like some weird extension of like throwing paint at like on a canvas, like abstract. Like it's like we didn't really make it, but like we made the system that made it. But it's interesting. I think it also just shows that like there is a distinctive thing about like the way humans make art that like computers can't pick up on. So anyway, if you're an art kind of nerd into that kind of stuff,
But I find that whole sort of area quite fascinating though, and I think even just the what was that art? I forget the name of the folks that did it, but they put a paintball gun on a one of those.
Oh yeah, we did. That was one of our early
dog robots, and it was sort of an interactive, like it went around sort of like paintballing different like statues and things in a gallery. And it was just sort of one of these weird.
I think that might have been our first ever host corner. One of our, maybe even predated host corners.
Yeah, but it's sort of where like technology and like AI and sort of crowdsourcing and all this sort of comes together in this thing that's like, is it art? Is it sort of a social experiment? Like, so I don't know. I think it's really interesting to sort of see just the creative. I think ultimately the creative ways that people sort of use technology. And so to me, maybe that's sort of where I land on some of this stuff is like, is the AI generated art? Is that art? Or I think more importantly, it's like people are still very creative in how they apply the tools that we have.
I think that's why I
am
so drawn to like thinking about like the philosophy of art and stuff. So I like messy things without simple answers. And I feel like art is just the prime example of that. But jumping into the next topic that I thought we could talk about, actually kind of piggybacking a bit. Like we said, this Turning Red movie is interesting as a conversation because it has sparked so many different types of conversations. I hope you guys enjoy it. I know we enjoyed having Joni on the desk last week, sharing kind of some of her perspective on, as an Asian American on this movie and getting into a conversation with her about that. But there were a couple other kind of, not really specific, we don't want to go just about this movie, the Turning Red itself, but I think kind of what it, some of the questions that it raised, I think are applicable beyond that. And here's one that I thought we could kind of wanted to get into a bit. And it's when movie characters aren't good role models. And really what I mean by that is this, hey, when characters are doing things that we don't necessarily want our own kids watching the movie to do it, or we don't necessarily want to follow. Batman's a good example of that, of, hey, he's a hero, but I don't know if we necessarily want everyone to leave the theater and go act like Batman. That would be chaos. That would be illegal. There's issues with that. And the Turning Red, kind of what sparked some of this for me is, if you haven't seen the movie, a lot of the kind of the premise of it is based on a 13-year-old girl that's going through puberty, and just sort of her relationship with her family, with her parents, and kind of the especially the mother character kind of needing to like accept and adapt to the fact that her kid isn't necessarily a kid anymore. And then the daughter kind of harnessing some of these new emotions and feelings. And like, she's kind of rebelling against her mom, and kind of both characters need to kind of bring the relationship back together, which I think is a good conversation and topic to deal with. But a lot of the like, comments and reviews and stuff that have come out of this movie have, especially, or at least by Christians, have really centered on the fact that like, this is not a movie kids should watch because it's showing rebellious kids. Kids shouldn't. Why would we glorify? In the movie, the girl sort of like twerking at her mom and like saying things that we want to that would earn my own kids a good time out. And there's a couple comments I pulled actually from our video review. We can throw those up, which sort of maybe can frame the discussion, and then we can kind of get into it. And this is sort of about that issue. One of the commenters talking about, hey, kids should have nothing to do with this movie. What a horrible movie. The Bible says that, kids should obey their parents. So why would Christians kind of endorse or want to think about a movie that shows kids not obeying their parents? And one of the commenters said, just because those things are in a movie doesn't mean they are encouraging or telling kids to do X, or that X is okay. And then the response to that was, then what is the purpose for putting these unnecessary, inappropriate taglines inside children's movies? And this is sort of, and obviously that discussion went on beyond those comments, but kind of like, what is the point then? Like, is it, what happens when characters in movies are acting in ways that don't align with how we think we're called to live as Christians, or if we're parents, how we think kids should live, basically when they're just not a good role model. Like, so what do you think of that? Is that, should we as Christians kind of only affirm movies of good role models, or is there more? Yeah,
well, I think that would greatly limit the number of movies, and would also preclude the Bible from being read to your children. So if you're okay with that, then by all means, go ahead and stop reading the Bible to your kids. But no, I think obviously there are things in the Bible that aren't endorsed, but they're part of the story of redemption, part of the story of failure. And I think the same is with movies and TV shows as well. Like there's lots of things, lots of characters who fail, and I think it's a great way to learn from how people handle a situation, even if it's fictionalized. It's like, well, this is how one person sort of handles this. Don't be that person. And unless it's sort of like portraying this person as the hero of like the show, and even then, still, like I think it can be helpful to see how different people behave in different situations. And that doesn't mean that this is the right way to behave in these situations. It just means this is how this character is doing it. And I think it can be a great opening for a dialogue with your kids. But also, like, just because they're behaving in a certain way, like what's the overall narrative of the movie as well? Like what's the story that's being told here? Like, does this person learn a lesson at the end? Like, is there a character arc that's being developed? And so like they have to start in a bad place before they get to the good place. But if it's just like only in the good place, well then there's not really any learning that takes place. So I don't really know what the point of watching that movie would be if it was just like, here's Johnny and he's always perfect to his parents, be like Johnny. Like that seems like a really dull movie, and I don't really know where you would go with that.
Yeah, and I don't think I don't necessarily want every character in every movie to like be the standard for like my kids, or that I need to somehow live up to this character. And I think it is again, I've been reviewing movies for a while, just dealing with cultural stuff for even longer than that, and this is like a very common way of like thinking about movies or just stories, even if it's not movies, like shows and books. And is just sort of this idea that like the purpose of it is to like show us how we should live and like be this example. I think that's why like most faith-based kind of Christian films, like the hero is always a Christian, and like they might like make a mistake, but like very clearly they're not perfect, but they're pretty close to perfect.
They got a smidge of road rage, but then they quoted their memory verse.
Yeah, they might say some language that's appropriate for a faith-based film, but then they clean their mouth out, and like but there's sort of this idea that like hey, we need sort of to this ideal, and that's the point of hero, and that's why I think like characters like Batman or like Katniss was with the Hunger Games, like some of these characters that is like, hey, they're the hero of the story, but like they're also kind of a jerk, or like they kind of mess up, and like even they kind of end the movie like maybe they've learned some lessons, but like they're also have a lot more to like. They're still not a great person. Like I feel like Christians just have a hard time, generally speaking, like can have a hard time. Like, what do you do with those sort of stories where it's like, hey, we don't want to be like this person. Like, is it okay to still cheer for them? Like, and I think like you said, like, I think we miss the I guess the broader potential of like stories that like, no, like you can learn from different, like, hey, a character that makes all the wrong choices and learns no lessons by the end. Like, I think there's value in the story like that, seeing that perspective. Like, I like depressing, like Thomas Hardy is one of my favorite authors. Like every one of his books is just horrible characters making horrible choices, and like their life falls apart, and that's how the book ends. Like just like the most depressing kind of stories. But like, I think there's still power in that, like to see this failure and sin. And like, I don't think I need to like aspire to be like any of the characters, but like, I don't know, is it just too narrow to like, just expect like, like every, like I think even just the fact that almost every hero in a Christian movie is a Christian, because I think we can't kind of conceive that we can like tell stories that aren't just like what we should be.
Well, and we should be a Christian. I think it's sort of this maybe Sunday school mentality that sort of has bled over into sort of movie making or filmmaking and storytelling. And so I think it's just very, very hard to come in as like a Christian or faith-based movie studio and make something that's more on the edge. And so I feel like it's just so hard to kind of get your mind around like not everything that you show is prescriptive. Like some of it may just be descriptive, and it's like, this is a story about a person. We're not saying you need to be this person. Like, and so I think maybe this like, Sunday school hangover that has come into, that's such a mix of metaphors, but that has come into sort of filmmaking is like this idea that like this is our only opportunity to like pack in all of the things that we need to tell these people that they should do. And so like I think there's this, rightfully or wrongfully, this need in a lot of these sort of faith-based films to sort of like have everything sort of out there, the moral of the story, the hero be like the ideal person, the ideal Christian, and we just have to get it all out there in one go, rather than sort of like, let's tell part of the story and make it a really good story, and worry less about sort of like getting in all of the like, and don't forget to eat your vegetables.
Yeah, kind of like the teaching. And I do think like maybe the like the caveat or the counterpoint or whatever you want to call it is like, for like kids, like the Turning Red movie, like there's the rebellious stuff to me didn't bother me. Like I don't think that movie, if I feel like with my own kids, like if seeing like an hour and a half movie is enough to like make them rebel against me, then like I need to step up my my parenting. I think it goes,
there's deeper issues, I guess,
but there is like the language used like in the movie is not something I want my kids repeating or like calling people different things. Like so like I get that it is also like it is more nuanced and like it's not like just anything goes and like we should just show our kids and embrace all these horrible characters but it's just sort of on a more general level. Like storytelling can focus on a lot of different things, and like even just like how many times in a Christian movie has like the atheist character like not converted at the end, like that the evangelism like didn't work, at least for that movie, like didn't change. Like I think that's a reality of life, and like we should deal with that too. So let us know. There's a lot we could go into with that, but I think this film, I think, at least to me, like so much of the beauty of storytelling is that like you can just kind of mess around with and deal with like crazy and like raw and like messy situations without having to like have the answers for them. It's just like, hey, here's a perspective, here's characters. Like as the audience, as the reader, like you kind of process that on your own. I'm not going to tell you how to think. I think we've sort of lost some of that, and especially as Christians. I feel like we're scared to do that because I don't know if we just don't trust people to like. It's like, here's some stuff, come on, process it on your own, but I want to make sure that you reach the conclusion that I need you to reach.
No, I think maybe there is just some fear of like, well, what if that movie, because we didn't absolutely spell it out in black and white, what if somebody takes the wrong thing? It's like, well, like people are going to take the wrong thing no matter what. And so I think it's not necessarily like up to us to like we can't like force people into thinking certain ways. And so it's like, you can present this, like maybe somebody took it out of context or got the wrong idea, but it's like, it's not necessarily like on us to like make sure that everyone views this the same way that we do. And I think there is just sort of this like, well, what if, these free thinking people, and what if they get other ideas in their head? And it's like, well, yeah, maybe they do. And maybe that's a great place to start a conversation. And so, I think there is some fear. Probably.
Yeah, it's just not everything needs to be a sermon, I think. And I think we feel like it does need to be a sermon. We need to have a message rather than just, hey, here's a story. Just sort of let this kind of work on you as sort of between you and God. But let us know your thoughts. Do you struggle with that? Are you, are there maybe any like heroes or protagonists, at least in stories, that you've kind of been impacted by that aren't necessarily like a embodiment of Christian virtue? Let us know in the comments section. I think there's definitely a lot to get into with that. But the last segment of our show, we have This Week at the Collision. We've been having a lot of stuff going on here at the Collision lately. Encourage you to check out if you're like just listening to us or watching us. We do have a website. You can also read stuff that we're doing, thecollision.org. I got some new articles out this week looking at different issues. Real deep theological discussion on the gospel according to time travel movies.
Oh, yeah.
As I tweeted out, I think it's a very timely discussion. So encourage you guys to check that out. Also got some stuff on artists. And again, we have written versions of our reviews, which if you've maybe watched our movie reviews and kind of want to see maybe a deeper level or kind of more spelled out, encourage you to check that out. As we plugged nonstop since we started this thing, we also have the audio only version of this live stream. If you're just not able to watch us, it's lunchtime on a weekday. A lot of people can't just watch this live. I encourage you to subscribe to our podcast. You can get this wherever you find podcasts. The Collision Live podcast. It's basically this live stream, but without the faces. So you can listen to us as you're going to work, or
some would say an improvement. But
yeah. Some would say you cut out all the stuff you don't want and keep the good stuff. So I encourage you to do that. Just join the conversation. You can still come back to our page, and if you want to comment or join, discuss stuff, you can still do that. But if it's easier for you, I encourage you to do that. Anything else kind of going on this week?
I think that's it. We've got some great articles on the Collision, and some more movie reviews coming up later in the week.
Yeah, and I feel like it's a total flex. This episode is brought to you by hydration. Trying to get better at drinking water. You should too. But most of all, guys, we want to say thanks for watching. Stay safe out there and continue to collide with your world for Christ.